In the heart of a village, where the even moon would pause to rest its weary light, and where the wind carried secrets on its gentle breath, there lived a mother whose heart was blacker than 1,000 midnights stacked upon each other, without a single star to offer hope. Her daughter, however, was a piece of heaven that had somehow tumbled down to earth and landed in the most unlikely of places, with skin the color of warm honey dripping from the comb at harvest time, and eyes that held the innocence of a newborn fawn, taking its very first trembling steps into a world it did not yet understand. The villagers, who were simple folk with simple ways but hearts that recognized truth when they saw it, would stop the girl on her way to the market or to the river and say, "Child, you are not of this world, for your beauty is a gift from the gods themselves, a blessing upon our humble village that we do not deserve." They would bring her small offerings of fresh bread still warm from the oven, or a handful of sweet berries they had gathered from the forest edge, not because they expected anything in return, but because being in her presence felt like standing in a ray of sunshine on the coldest day. This praise, which should have filled a mother's heart with pride so great it might burst from her chest with joy, instead filled her with a poison so potent and so vile that it began to rot her soul from the inside out, like a fruit that looks perfect on the outside but is hollow and putrefied within. For this mother was once the jewel of the village, the woman every man desired and every woman envied, the one who could not walk down a path without leaving a trail of sighs behind her. But time, the great thief that steals from everyone equally, had stolen her youth and left her with nothing but memories and wrinkles. Now, every wrinkle on her face was a reminder of what she had lost, and every glance at her daughter was a mirror reflecting that loss back at her with cruel clarity. She began to see her own child not as a blessing, not as flesh of her flesh and blood of her blood, but a rival, a thief who had sneaked into her life while she slept and stolen the beauty that was rightfully hers. This thought grew in her mind like a weed in a garden, choking out every memory of love, every moment of tenderness she had ever felt when she held her baby in her arms, until there was nothing left but a vast empty space filled with hatred and envy. And in that dark space, she began to plot a wickedness so profound, so unnatural, that it would make even the demons in the deepest pits of hell tremble with fear and cover their eyes in shame. The daughter, whose name was Amara, which meant grace in the old tongue, lived in blissful ignorance of the storm brewing in her mother's heart, unaware that every smile her mother gave her was a mask stretched tight over a face contorted with loathing. She spent her days tending to the garden behind their small hut, singing to the birds that came to feast on the seeds she scattered, and helping the less fortunate who passed by their door, for her heart was as beautiful as her face, perhaps even more so. She would share their meager meals with beggars, would sit with the sick and hold their hands, would run errands for the elderly who could no longer walk the long paths to the village square. Her goodness was not something she performed for show, but something that flowed from her naturally, like water from a spring, and everyone who met her felt cleaner and brighter for having been in her presence. One day, as the sun was climbing to its highest point and the heat made the air shimmer like a dream, she was drawing water from the village well, her arms strong from the work, when a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. Out of this dust emerged a royal messenger, covered in the grime of a long journey, his horse foaming at the mouth from being pushed so hard. He called out in a voice hoarse from shouting, make way for the king's word." He unmounted in the center of the village and unrolled a scroll sealed with the royal crest, a golden sunburst that seemed to glow even in the daylight. The villagers gathered around, their hearts pounding with curiosity and excitement, for nothing this important had ever happened in their quiet corner of the kingdom. The messenger read aloud that the prince of the kingdom, a man known far and wide for his wisdom that exceeded his years and his kindness that knew no bounds, was to choose a bride, and he had heard whispers carried on the wind from village to village of a girl in this place whose beauty was matched only by her virtue, whose face was like the dawn, and whose heart was like the purest gold. He humbly requested to see this girl, to meet her and speak with her, to discover if the whispers spoke truth. The villagers, almost as one, turned to look at Amara, who stood by the well with her water pot frozen halfway to her shoulder, her honey-colored skin flushing with confusion she did not understand. Her mother, standing in the shadow of their hut, heard these words and felt something inside her crack, a hairline fracture in what remained of her sanity, for she knew in that instant that her daughter's fate was about to surpass her own in every possible way. When the prince arrived 3 days later, he came not with the pomp and ceremony one might expect, but quietly, almost humbly, riding a simple horse and accompanied by only a small escort. He had wanted to see Amara as she truly was, not surrounded by the trappings of royalty that might make her act differently. He found her in the garden behind her mother's hut, kneeling in the dirt, her hands covered in soil as she pulled weeds from around the yam plants. She did not hear him approach, so intent was she on her work, and when she finally looked up and saw a stranger watching her, she smiled without pretense or shyness and said, "Welcome, traveler. If you are thirsty, there is fresh water by the door." The prince later said that in that moment, when she smiled at him as if he was simply another person passing through, he felt his heart leave his chest and place itself in her hands forever. He was not just captivated by her outward appearance, beautiful though it was, but by the gentle spirit that shone through her eyes like sunlight through clear water. He spoke with her for hours as she continued her work, asking her about the plants she grew, about the village, about her life. He told her nothing of who he was, and she asked nothing, treating him with the same simple kindness she showed everyone. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, he was hopelessly, irrevocably in love, not with an idea of beauty, but with a real person, whose soul was as lovely as her face. The very next day, he returned with his full royal entourage, and this time there was no mistaking who he was. The entire village gathered in the square as the prince, dressed in robes of gold and white, got down on one knee before Amara and in front of everyone asked for her hand in marriage. Amara, her heart fluttering like a caged bird trying to escape her chest, her eyes filling with tears of disbelief and joy, said yes without a moment's hesitation. The village erupted in joy, drums began to beat, women broke into song, children danced in the dust. But one person stood frozen, her face a mask of stone that revealed nothing of the volcano erupting within. It was Amara's mother. As she watched the handsome prince, young and powerful and rich beyond imagining, place a golden ring on her daughter's finger, as she had the cheers of the crowd celebrating her daughter's good fortune, the last shred of humanity in her withered and died like a flower in a drought, replaced by a cold, calculating hatred that knew no bounds and would stop at nothing to achieve its dark purpose. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of preparation that swept through the village like a joyful storm. The palace sent the finest silks the kingdom could produce, bolts of cloth in colors that seemed to have been stolen from rainbows and sunsets. They sent the sweetest perfumes in crystal bottles, oils that smelled of jasmine and roses and exotic flowers from distant lands. They sent the most exquisite jewels, rubies as red as the heart's blood, sapphires as blue as the deepest ocean, diamonds that caught the light and threw it back 100 times brighter. Amara would spend hours each day trying on these wonderful things, giggling and spinning in her new finery, her laughter like bells ringing in a clear sky. And her mother was always there, always watching, always smiling and clapping her hands and telling everyone who would listen how proud she was, how blessed she felt. But behind that smile, behind those empty words, a plan was taking shape. A plan so vile it would curdle fresh milk and make the bravest warrior shudder. She could not bear the thought of her daughter becoming a queen, of being worshipped by the entire kingdom, of living a life of luxury and adoration that she herself would never know, not in this life or another. The thought burned in her mind like a fever, consuming her waking hours and invading her dreams. She began to research old traditions, to ask the village elders about ancient customs, to pretend she wanted to honor her daughter properly. She learned of a forgotten ritual, a practice from centuries past, where the mother of the bride would take her daughter deep into the forest on the night before the wedding, to a hidden shrine of the ancestors, there to anoint her with sacred oils and receive blessings for a fruitful marriage. It was the perfect cover, the perfect lie, and she wrapped herself in it like a cloak. Under this guise of a mother's love and devotion to tradition, she began to lay her trap with the patience and precision of a spider spinning its web. She told Amara about the ritual with tears in her eyes, speaking of how her own mother had done this for her, and her grandmother before that, and how important it was to honor the ancestors who watched over them from the spirit world. Amara, who trusted her mother completely, who had known nothing but the love she thought she received, agreed with a grateful heart, touched that her mother wanted to make their bond so special. She told the prince about the plan, and he, knowing nothing of the darkness lurking in her future mother-in-law's heart, thought it a beautiful tradition and gave his blessing. What Amara did not know, what she could never have imagined in her wildest nightmares, was that her mother had no intention of taking her to any shrine. There was no shrine in that part of the forest, hadn't been for hundreds of years. Instead, her mother had made a deal with a band of ruthless outlaws who hid in the deepest, darkest part of the woods, men who had no respect for life or life, who would do anything for enough gold. For a pouch of the prince's gold, a small fortune that her mother had managed to steal from the gifts meant for Amara, these men were to wait at a certain clearing. They would capture the girl, silence her forever, and throw her body into a ravine so deep and so hidden that no one would ever find it, not in 1,000 years. The mother would then return to the village, weeping and wailing, tearing her clothes and her hair, and tell a tale of a tragic accident, of how her precious daughter had stumbled on the dark path, fallen into the rushing river, and been swept away before she could do anything to save her. Who would doubt a mother's grief? Who would question a woman who had just lost her only child? But the walls have ears that hear what they should not, and the trees have eyes that see what is hidden. A young stable boy from the palace, a lad of perhaps 16 years, with a face still smooth as a girl's, but a heart already wise beyond its years, had developed a secret and pure love for Amara. He loved her not with the desperate passion of a man who hopes to possess, but with the quiet devotion of one who is content simply to be near the light. He had noticed things about the mother that others missed. He saw the way her smile never quite reached her eyes, leaving them cold like winter ponds. He saw the way her hands trembled when she looked at her daughter, not with the tremble of age or emotion, but with something darker, something that looked like suppressed violence. His suspicions grew with each passing day, and he began to watch her more closely, following her at a distance when she went into the village, noting the strange hours she kept, the furtive glances she cast over her shoulder. On the day before the wedding, when the whole village was busy with final preparations and no one was paying attention to one old woman, his vigilance paid off. He saw her slip away from the celebrations, not toward the village, but toward the forest. His heart pounding with a mixture of fear and certainty, he followed her, staying far enough back that she would not notice, close enough that he would not lose her. She walked deep into the woods, farther than any ordinary person would go, until she came to a clearing where 3 rough men waited, their faces hidden by shadow and scarves. The young stable boy, whose name was Kofi, crept closer and hid behind a massive baobab tree, its trunk wide enough to hide 10 men. He pressed himself against the rough bark and listened, and what he heard made his blood run cold in his veins. He heard every word of their wicked agreement, the clinking of the gold coins as they changed hands, the detailed description of the girl they were to capture, the exact location of the ambush, the plan for disposing of the body. He heard the mother's voice, cold and businesslike, discussing the murder of her own child as if she were negotiating the price of vegetables at the market. He heard the outlaw's laugh, a sound without humor, and promised to make it quick and painless, as if that made any difference. Kofi stayed frozen behind the tree until the mother had left and the outlaws had melted back into the shadows. Then, with the stealth of a hunting cat and the speed of a gazelle fleeing a lion, he ran. He ran faster than he had ever run in his life, not back toward the village where he might raise an alarm and cause a commotion that would alert the mother, but in the opposite direction, through the forest, taking paths he knew from his childhood, heading straight for the royal palace. Branches whipped at his face, thorns tore at his clothes, his lungs burned like fire, but he did not stop. He could not stop. The image of Amara's kind face, of her gentle smile, of her trusting eyes drove him forward. He burst into the palace courtyard long after the sun had set, breathless and wild-eyed, his clothes torn and his skin scratched and bleeding. The guards tried to stop him, but he fought them with a strength born of desperation, screaming that he had to see the prince, that it was a matter of life and death. The commotion brought the prince himself to the courtyard, and Kofi fell at his feet, gasping for breath, and poured out the whole terrible story. "My prince," gasping between ragged breaths, "the mother of Amara, she is not what she seems. She has paid men to kill her own child this very night, in the forest, at the place where she said the shrine would be. You must go. You must stop them. There is no time." The prince's face went pale as ash, then flushed with a furious rage such as those who knew him had never seen. His hands clenched into fists, his jaw tightened until the muscles stood out like cords. But he did not waste time with questions or with anger. He acted. In a voice that cracked like a whip, he called for his most trusted guards, 20 men who had served his family for generations and whose loyalty was beyond question. He ordered them to arm themselves and prepare to ride immediately. Within minutes, they were mounted and moving, the prince himself leading them, his face set like stone. They did not take the main road, which would have been slower and more visible. Instead, they took the paths Kofi knew, the secret ways through the forest that would bring them to the clearing ahead of the mother and daughter. The moon had not yet risen, and the darkness under the trees was complete. But the guards knew these woods almost as well as Kofi did, and they moved with a silence that was almost supernatural. They reached the vicinity of the clearing and dismounted, leaving their horses tied to trees, and crept forward on foot until they were in position, hidden behind the same massive baobab tree that hid Kofi and behind others like it. And then they waited, their weapons drawn, their eyes straining in the darkness, their hearts pounding with anticipation. They did not have to wait long. As the moon finally began to rise, casting a pale silver light through the canopy of leaves, they heard the sound of approaching footsteps. 2 figures emerged from the trees, a woman in a dark cloak, walking with purpose, and behind her, a young girl in a simple white dress, picking her way carefully along the path. It was Amara and her mother. The prince's heart clenched with a pain so sharp it was almost physical, seeing how trustingly Amara followed the woman who planned to murder her, how she looked around at the forest with wonder rather than fear, probably thinking about the ancestors and the blessings they would receive. The mother stopped at the edge of the clearing, the very spot where she had met with the outlaws, and told Amara to wait while she prepared the ritual space. Amara nodded and turned her back, looking up at the moon beginning to show through the trees. As soon as her back was turned, the mother gave a signal, a low whistle that cut through the night air. From the shadows on the far side of the clearing, the outlaws emerged, 3 large men with cruel faces and weapons in their hands, moving toward the unsuspecting girl like wolves approaching a lamb. At that exact moment, the prince gave his own signal. His guards sprang from their hiding places with a shout that shattered the silence of the forest. They surrounded the outlaws in an instant, cutting off any chance of escape. A brief but fierce fight broke out, the clang of steel on steel echoing through the trees. But the royal guards were too skilled, too numerous, too determined. Within minutes, the outlaws were on the ground, some wounded, all subdued, their weapons knocked from their hands, their bodies pinned to the earth. Amara screamed, a sound of pure terror, and whirled around, not understanding what was happening, seeing only strange men fighting in the darkness. The prince ran to her and caught her in his arms, shielding her from the sight of the men who would have ended her life, holding her tight against his chest while she trembled and sobbed in confusion and fear. The mother stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. For one long moment, she stood as if turned to stone, unable to move, unable to think. Then instinct took over, and she tried to run, to disappear into the forest, to escape the consequences of her actions. But the guards were faster. 2 of them caught her before she had gone 10 paces, seizing her roughly by the arms and dragging her back into the clearing, where the torchlight now illuminated the scene. They threw her to the ground before the prince, who still held Amara protectively. The mother looked up, and for the first time, her eyes met her daughter's. Amara, her tears still wet on her cheeks, looked from her mother's terrified face to the bound outlaws, to the pouch of gold lying on the ground where it had fallen during the struggle, to the cruel faces of the men who had meant to kill her. Slowly, painfully, the truth began to dawn on her, each piece clicking into place like the parts of a terrible puzzle. The special ritual, the insistence on going alone, the strange behavior of the past weeks, it all made a horrible, sickening kind of sense. The truth hit her like a physical blow, and she let out a sound so full of anguish, so raw with betrayal, that it made the prince's heart shatter into 1,000 pieces and brought tears to the eyes of the hardened guards who had seen terrible things in their service. "Why?" she whispered, her voice trembling like a leaf in the wind. "I am your daughter. I loved you. I have always loved you. What did I do to deserve this? What sin did I commit against you that you would want me dead?" The mother could not meet her eyes. She could not look at the face of the daughter she had tried to murder. She just hung her head, her wickedness finally exposed for all to see, her silence more damning than any confession could have been. The prince gently but firmly took Amara away from that place of evil, leading her back through the forest to where the horses waited, wrapping his cloak around her trembling shoulders, murmuring words of comfort that she could not hear through the storm of grief raging in her heart. The guards followed, dragging the bound outlaws and the mother, who walked like a woman already dead, her feet moving but her spirit gone. The news of the mother's treachery spread through the village, and the kingdom, like wildfire driven by a strong wind, leaping from house to house, from village to village, until there was no one within the borders of the land who had not heard the terrible tale. People could not believe that a mother could harbor such hate for her own child, could plan such evil against the life she had brought into the world. Old women shook their heads and muttered about the old days when such wickedness was punished by being buried alive. Young men clenched their fists and wished they could have been there to protect Amara. Mothers held their own children closer and thanked the gods that their hearts were not so black. A trial was held in the great hall of the palace, a hall so large that it could hold every villager from every village within a day's ride, and on the day of the trial, it was filled to overflowing. People stood in the aisles, they crowded the doorways, they pressed against the walls, all of them hungry for justice, all of them wanting to see with their own eyes how the kingdom would deal with such an unnatural crime. The evidence was presented, clear and undeniable. The captured outlaws, hoping for mercy, confessed everything, implicating the mother in full detail, describing how she had approached them, how she had paid them, how she had planned every step of the murder. The stable boy Kofi, brave and trembling, told his story to the silent crowd, his voice growing stronger as he spoke, bolstered by the gasps of horror that greeted each revelation. The mother had no defense, for her guilt was written plainly on her face for all to see. And when she tried to speak, to offer excuses, to blame her daughter for being too beautiful, too loved, too fortunate, the crowd roared with such anger that she shrank back and said no more. The judge, an old and wise man named Ambamfo, whose voice had the power of thunder and whose eyes had seen more than 100 years of human folly, rose to pronounce the sentence. He spoke first of the sacred bond between mother and child, a bond that was supposed to be the strongest in all of human experience, stronger than the bond between husband and wife, stronger than the bond between a king and subject, even stronger than the bond between a person and their own life. He spoke of how this woman had violated that bond, had trampled on it, had sold it for a pouch of gold. He declared her crime to be the worst kind of sin, a sin against nature, against the gods, against everything that made humanity better than the beasts of the field. The punishment, he said, must fit the crime. She was stripped of her name, for she no longer deserved to be called by the name her own mother had given her. She was stripped of all her possessions, every stick of furniture, every scrap of clothing, every memory of her former life. She would spend the rest of her natural life in a small stone cell in the deepest dungeon of the kingdom. A cell with only a tiny slit for light, with only bread and water for sustenance, with only her own wicked thoughts for company. There she would remain until the day she died, forgotten by the world she had tried to destroy, a fate that many in the crowd said was far more merciful than what she truly deserved. Some called for her to be executed, others for her to be tortured, but the wise judge held firm, saying that a long life of solitude and reflection was a punishment that would give her time to understand the full weight of what she had done. The wedding of Prince Kofi and Amara, which had been delayed by these terrible events, was finally celebrated with even greater joy than had been planned. For it was not just a union of two hearts, but a triumph of good over evil, of light over darkness, of love over hate. The entire kingdom rejoiced for 7 full days and 7 full nights. There was music and dancing, feasting and celebration, fireworks that lit up the sky and made the stars themselves seem dim by comparison. Gifts poured in from every corner of the land, from the richest noble to the poorest peasant, each person wanting to show their love for the new princess who had suffered so much and emerged so strong. Amara became a queen not just of beauty, which she still possessed in abundance, but of great wisdom and even greater compassion. She had learned the hardest lesson that life can teach, that evil can wear the face of those you love most, that trust can be betrayed in the worst possible way, and yet that it is still possible to go on living, to go on loving, to go on being good. She visited the stable boy Kofi often and made sure he was given a position of honor in the palace, for she never forgot that he had saved her life. She spoke to the captured outlaws before they were taken away to their own punishments and forgave them, which confused them more than any punishment could have. And sometimes when she was alone, she would think of her mother in that cold stone cell, and she would weep, not for herself, but for the woman who had been so consumed by jealousy that she had destroyed not only her daughter's trust, but her own soul. The story of the jealous mother became a tale told to every child born in the kingdom for generations to come, a dark fable whispered around fires on cold nights, a cautionary tale repeated by mothers to daughters and fathers to sons. It was a reminder that beauty is a gift to be celebrated, not a prize to be fought over, that a jealous heart is a curse that destroys the one who carries it far more surely than it destroys the one it envies, and that the love between a parent and a child is a sacred flame that should never ever be extinguished by the cold, bitter winds of envy. The story grew in the telling as stories do, with details added and embellished, but the core remained the same: a mother's hate, a daughter's love, and the triumph of truth over lies. Children would listen with wide eyes, and when the story was done, they would ask their parents, "Could such a thing really happen?" And the parents would look at each other and then at their children, and they would say, "It did happen long ago and far away." And that is why we must always guard our hearts against jealousy, for it is the poison that kills love. And so the story of Amara, the beautiful daughter, and her wicked mother, and the prince who loved her, and the stable boy who saved her, was etched forever into the memory of the land, a tale of sorrow and treachery, of courage and devotion, and of the unbreakable power of truth to shine through even the darkest night. The kingdom prospered under their reign, and when Amara and Kofi had children of their own, they told them the story too, not as a warning, but as a testament to the fact that no matter how dark the world becomes, love will always find a way to survive. And if you travel to that kingdom today, you can still hear old people telling the tale to anyone who will listen. And if you listen closely enough, you might just hear in the whisper of the wind through the trees the echo of a mother's tears and a daughter's forgiveness, mingled together in the eternal dance of light and shadow that is the human heart.